I'm from a very small town in rural Saskatchewan, and I recall growing up many times, my mom was a nurse, and I recall many, many times that she would tell me about all these wild things that were happening in this small healthcare system in rural Saskatchewan. And there was one individual who I remember in particular who was I would say a very functional member of the town. And she had a baby, a young child. And then I recall, and I was about 10 years old at this time, that she would really just drive around our small town trying to cope with whatever was going on with her. And at the time, I didn't really understand what was going on. I was only 10 years old. And I now look back at this situation and I think this is a young individual who is very functional and had a significant change in her body and her mind and her chemistry. And that was through having a child, and is now and was at the time suffering from what we would call postpartum depression. And I couldn't put these things together. And it wasn't until I really got into medical school that I started thinking about this individual and how they didn't get access to care. They didn't get the care that they deserved. And they're dealing with so much on their own and literally in a car in this lonely town, driving around all day long, trying to cope with that. And that stuck with me because I think one of my missions in starting Headversity is to try and get individuals access to care, access to tools and skills that I think are important in terms of helping us with things like burnout and issues like burnout. And burnout is a very real situation in our healthcare system. It's on the macro scale, it costs our healthcare system hundreds of millions of dollars, but that doesn't matter because what matters is it makes us feel like we can't go back to work, enjoy our lives, enjoy our home lives, and really improve as healthcare professionals. And the thing that bothers me most about this topic is that if you hear a webinar, what you're going to hear from people is make sure you get good sleep and make sure you have a healthy diet and take lots of breaks at work and make sure you exercise. Okay, yes, that is all very important. But burnout is a very personal issue. It impacts me differently than it impacts you, differently than it impacts the next individual. So the thing that bothers me with this is we get such generic advice around this topic. We get advice about like the cardinal things that you have to do around sleep and how to mix up your diet and how to set boundaries in our life and how to exercise. And yeah, these are all important skills, but it impacts us so differently that when we get this generic advice, it doesn't help. And I would actually argue that it hurts because it feels so depersonalized and so generic that it really disenfranchises us from whoever's talking or speaking about that. And it makes it feel like it doesn't matter that we have these symptoms and these signs around burnout. And what I want to talk about today is, well, first of all, some of the statistics around burnout, because I think it's important to know that we're not alone in this as individuals. But I want to talk through some of the concepts and how we're thinking about burnout as psychiatrists and those who are in the mental health field and trying to get ahead of this epidemic. I want us to talk through some concepts, but know that everything that I talk about today, you are going to have to do some work to apply it to your own context, or it will just sound generic. It'll sound like some study done 100 years ago that doesn't really apply to you. But we're also going to talk about how to personalize some of these concepts and make them more important and salient in your life so we can prevent burnout. And if you are feeling those symptoms right now, those symptoms of burnout, that gut feeling like, I don't think I can go on with this job, I don't think I can go on with this particular aspect of care, I'm hoping that some of the things that we talk about can resonate and help you personalize them in your life. Okay, so let's cover some of the statistics around burnout and talk about why this impacts healthcare workers more than almost any other field that we see. Here's a shocking statistic to those who maybe aren't in healthcare. About 50% of healthcare workers are more likely to experience burnout compared to other industries. I don't know if that shocks anyone, but this is like a high-ranking burnout statistic. We know that 44% of nurses at any given time, a third of physicians at any given time are reporting burnout. We had seen both the incidence of burnout and then also the cultural phenomenon increase during COVID. And what I mean by that is that we had a a better understanding and language around it. If I was a psychiatrist 20 years ago doing a webinar, or maybe I recorded something on VHS and everyone was sitting in a room watching it, we probably wouldn't have had the language around burnout. And that's okay. That's how mental health evolves in my experience. And we get these concepts and we kind of chew them up and we get some boundaries around these concepts. And then we get a better understanding of how we can think about them and how we can treat them and how we can think about them as healthcare professionals. And you might ask why burnout is more prevalent in healthcare. And whenever I talk to people about this who might not be in healthcare, I always say we have really weird jobs. And it's a really odd thing to do. I remember when I was in medical school in my third year, I was consulting in neurology on an 11-year-old when her mom was there, and they look absolutely terrified, both of these individuals. And I didn't really know what was going on, but this young individual lost the ability to use her right arm. And that was very scary for an 11-year-old. And it was only hours after that I found out, and I had to communicate to this family with another physician that she had a brain tumor. That is not something that is a normal human experience. That's a very traumatic experience for everyone involved. It's a very negative experience for everyone involved, and it gives you that gut feeling that you just absolutely will never forget. And I know everyone who is here right now has had a very similar experience of something that you would not experience in the outside world. If you're not in a healthcare facility, if you're not in a clinic, if you're not in a hospital, you just won't experience these things. And we are left to, and sometimes without training or education around it, processing these things and trying to make sense of them and make meaning from them and try to put a narrative around them that can help us. And that's most of my work as a psychiatrist, if I'm working with a patient who is in healthcare, is to think about those times that are traumatic and that do propagate burnout and try to put a story or a narrative around it that makes sense and in the best cases, in the most therapeutic cases, can bring some meaning to that situation or even importance to that situation, that you were there as a healthcare provider. You were the person giving that diagnosis, and you might have done that in a therapeutic and meaningful way to that family or even that little girl. This is why we struggle with burnout in healthcare, because it's a weird, often non-human situation that we're put in. And sometimes we're put in these situations for full 8 and 12-hour shifts. And I remember early in my residency, we do these 26-hour shifts. And that's also in and of itself the physical exhaustion that accompanies a lot of the work we do. But this here, compassion fatigue, this is something that I think is very real in this industry that we don't see often in other industries. And compassion fatigue, I think, is something that we should have a deep understanding about, because I think this is something that comes up time and time again, something that we really want to pay attention to in and of ourselves. And so what is compassion fatigue? It's the physical and emotional exhaustion when you're engaging with someone in difficulty. Okay, we don't often get compassion fatigue when we're talking to someone and they're having a great day. We get compassion fatigue when we're working in an emerge shift and we are seeing people who are coming in on the worst day of their life, and they are suffering and they are ill and they are unwell and their families come in. And that's the thing personally that always gets me and that increases my levels of compassion fatigue is working with families. And I recall this in my work that I previously did. I don't do as much anymore, but I previously did a lot of work in palliative care. And I remember working with the patients in palliative care. You know, I would often get inspired because they always had, I found, a narrative around death and dying and that experience that sort of made sense. And you heard so many amazing stories about their life. Where I really struggled personally with compassion fatigue was in working with their families and all the conflict that comes with death and dying and all the politics and the inner family dynamics and even the support, all the good things still takes an emotional toll on that energy. And I found that, and I continue to find that in that work. So I think for you, what I'd encourage you to do is have a deep understanding of what are the things that create compassion fatigue for you, because that leads to burnout. That is a direct line. We know that the more fatigue you have around being compassionate for others and continually exercising that empathic muscle for patients, loved ones, and family, the more often that we do get burnt out. Okay, here's a core concept. I'm going to cover about 3 or 4 core concepts around burnout and around anxiety and around fatigue that I'd like you to try and apply to your own situation. Then we're going to do a couple of exercises, and then we're going to talk about some key concepts of really where do we go from here around burnout and compassion fatigue. This is a concept that is like, of course, this is how it works. But 110 years ago, this was not so clear. And there was 2 researchers, 2 social psychologists. Their name were Yerkes and Dodson. And this is a famous study done with over the course of many months with mice. And what they did, Yerkes and Dodson, was they would test the cognition of a mouse. And they would do that with those little memory things, those little mazes that we see. They'd put like cheese at the end of a maze, like the classic mouse going through a maze situation. And what they'd do is they'd stress that mouse out. Now, how do you stress a mouse out? Okay, you give them a little electric shock, which is terribly cruel. You would maybe not feed them as much, which is terribly cruel. The other thing they would do is they would change the social hierarchy of the mouse, okay? So what they would do is they would, if they had an alpha mouse who would typically eat first, they would block that mouse from eating, and they would put the beta mouse and they'd let that mouse eat first. Now, mice, unbeknownst to many researchers, had a very strong social hierarchy. So if they changed that, it would stress them out a lot, right? So what did we learn from this study? The main finding was this performance curve here. What we found, what Yerkes and Dodson found, these social psychologists, with that at the highest levels of anxiety, our cognition and our performance is not very good. And that makes sense, right? If you're like near panic level, you have high levels of cortisol all the time, you're not performing well in your job. Your memory is not sharp. You're not articulating. Your frontal lobe is not operating in the same way it should be. You're not sequencing and planning and abstracting, all the things that make us humans. You're not doing that well. They also found, though, with low levels of stimulation, with low levels of stress, what they called boredom or apathy, you're also performing at the same very poor level. Now, what they found was there was this optimal level of stress, okay, where we would rate that between a 4 and a 6 out of 10. That's when our memory is the sharpest. That is when we're abstracting and reasoning and problem solving and articulating our finest as human beings and as mice. Okay, you might say, yes, of course, that's how it works. Like, we need this optimal level of stress. But this is important because stress is helpful for us. We know that stress increases happiness at a certain level. It increases performance at a certain level. But what we're trying to avoid are chronic levels of stress. Okay, so let's talk about how stress in the brain works. And I know there's many here that work in neurology and work in this field of pathology. So this will be a refresher, but what we know is that there's a small part of the brain called the amygdala, and that is a highly sensitive area to things like cortisol and epinephrine and adrenaline, these hormones that shoot out from the top of our kidneys, those little glands, the adrenal glands. And what that does when this part of the brain, that small part of the brain, gets hit with adrenaline, is it creates that fight, flight, or freeze response, okay? And we all learned that in grade 9 and 10. That's how that works, is when you get that hormone hits that part of the brain, fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, what that also does is it shuts down this front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. And that is where you sequence, and that is where you plan, and that is where you abstract and reason. So you're not really thinking, you're just responding. You're fight, flight, or freeze. Of course, your adrenaline's peaked up. In the short term, that's a very good thing, right? In the short term, we are more acute. in terms of and how we remember things and our energy. Our pupils are literally dilated. Our breathing rate goes up. Our heart rate and blood pressure goes up. This is all when designed when we were trying to escape from the saber-toothed tiger and we had that peak of adrenaline. These are all really good things in the short term. What we know, however, is that if these things happen in the long term, that is when we get chronic stress. And that is when the deleterious effects of stress kick in. And that is when burnout kicks in. If we're having repeated episodes where you feel that pang in your stomach, that anxiety, and that fight, flight, or freeze response in your amygdala, if we continually get those cortisol spikes, that is when we start to see the negative effects of stress. So the main takeaway here for us is we experience stress. In the short term, stress is very good. It has a lot of important mental health and physical health effects. Long term, chronically, stress is bad. And that's what leads to burnout. And that's really the core topic of what we're talking about today. It's a very natural part of what we experience. I experience stress, you experience stress, everyone experiences stress. The most common types of stress, according to the American Psychological Association, number 1 is health. Number 2 is money. Number 3 is family. Number 4 actually is work stress. Number 4 is work stress. So we know that there's all these factors that contribute to the stress that we experience on a day-to-day. Okay, the third concept that I want to cover is how we can start to visualize and think differently about stress such that we can personalize it and then improve our resilience. And by resilience, I mean our ability to lower that cortisol so we don't have stress that is chronic, and lower that cortisol so we can not feel that pang of anxiety when you work up and you know you have to do something crappy at work for 8 hours straight. That burnout effect, that's what we're really trying to reduce for ourselves. And the concept that I want to talk about is red brain and blue brain. And this is more of a visualization. This is more of a cartoon to help us get into that mindset of identifying our emotional state. We know that if you can identify an emotional state, simply naming an emotion reduces intensity of that negative emotion. In psychiatry, we say name it to tame it. All right, name it to tame it. What we want to do with our physical selves is identify where we're at, where our brain is at. If you're very stressed out, you are not mindful, you are scattered, you are exhausted, you are at the end of a 12-hour shift that was just wild, and there was conflict, and there was time pressure, and a mountain of things to do, and you didn't get to them, and you just feel gross, that is when you are in your red brain state. On the other hand, I want you to think of the other extreme. When you are feeling relaxed, or you're feeling like you're in the flow, even at work or home or with a relationship, you're in that flow zone, and you are mindful, and you are well rested, and you are focused, and you're dialed in cognitively, that is the blue brain state. I think one of my main jobs as a psychiatrist is to help get people into that blue brain state for as much of their life as possible. Is that red brain state going to hit? Of course. It will hit. We are all human. We all experience stress. We all experience sadness. We all experience strain and exhaustion and conflict. And there's some things that we can do with ourselves personally that we can try to get into that blue brain state of cognition and that way of thinking and that way of feeling. That's what I'd like us to think about. And what I'd really encourage you to do is next time that you're feeling really stressed, and you're feeling like you are burnt out in that state or you are exhausted, just simply identify that you're in the red brain state. Just say it out loud or even write it down or just kind of make a note to yourself. I feel like I'm in that red brain state. Why do I want you to do that? Because there is a lot of evidence to show through functional MRI that if you're able to name that negative state or that negative emotion, it reduces the oxygenation, reduces the glucose uptake to that amygdala, that part of your brain that is just simply not functioning as well. Okay, red brain, blue brain, that's what I want you to think about going forward. But before that, I want to take us through a quick cognitive behavioral therapy exercise because I think this is one of the most important skills that I try and teach as a psychiatrist to help those who are in a burnout state and those who are trying to prevent burnout in the future. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the whiteboard and we're going to write some of this out around what is cognitive behavioral therapy and how do we think about CBT. Okay. So psychiatrists, anyone in psychology, we're thinking of three main states. This work was done by a gentleman named George Engel in the early 90s, late 80s, and this was really the root for Aaron Beck and the cognitive behavioral theory. So we have three things that essentially make us human: thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Okay, thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I want to put a little Venn diagram here because we are right in the middle of all three of these experiences. All right, that is essentially what makes us a human being. So we all have thoughts. Thoughts are described as an image or even a sentence. Emotions, I would describe these as one word: disgust, anger, happy, sad, elated. You can describe emotions with one word. Thoughts are many words. And we, of course, have our physical feelings, our physical and physiological responses to things. Okay, so these all interact, but I'd like to challenge us and think about what are the things that we can actually modify. Can we directly modify our physiologic feeling? Can I say, let's raise your blood pressure right now? No, of course we can't do that. Can I directly impact your emotional state? Now that's an interesting question. And I would argue that no, we cannot directly impact that emotional state. We can't say, be sad right now or be super happy. That doesn't work like that. What we can do is directly impact our thoughts. We can change our thoughts, we can modify them, we can manipulate our thoughts, we can identify our thoughts. For example, if I said, think of a pink elephant right now, everyone just thought of a pink elephant. Okay, that is just what I did, what you did. So we can actually manipulate these thoughts, but importantly, we can manipulate these thoughts such that it changes our emotional state. This was the breakthrough finding with Aaron Beck in the mid-'80s with cognitive behavioral therapy, is if we do a lot of work on thinking about how we think and modifying those thoughts, not necessarily to make them super positive or everything is sunshine and rainbows, but to make them more balanced, we can change that emotional experience. And we can also change that burnout experience, because that's really what burnout is. It's a core negative emotion that we can't quite put our finger on. We don't really know what's going on, but it's a really negative emotional experience. That's how I'd like us to think about it. And if we can change these thoughts, then we can modify this pattern of emotion. And we can also change, if we change over time our emotional experience, we can actually change our physiology. We know from years of mindfulness studies that if we can clear our thoughts, have clarity of thought, simplify our thoughts, we can actually lower our blood pressure and our heart rate. All right, we know that if we can change our emotions to be more balanced, as opposed to net negative and continuous stress, that we can change things like how much cortisol is floating around in our blood and how much our heart beats quickly and our heart rate and our breathing rate. These are all physiologic feelings that we can actually modify over time with cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, so thanks for listening to that, because I think this is going to inform part of a little exercise that I want to do with everyone. So let's take a couple minutes. If you have a pen and paper at home, I think that'd be really helpful to do this exercise with me. This is called the ICE Thinking Tool. And we're going to also make this available on the Headversity app, which you'll get access to in a couple moments here. But I want us to write down these three letters on a piece of paper, if you could, right now. All right, so I'll give everyone just a second, and we'll do a little bit of lonely work here. I want you to write down these three letters. This is identify, challenge, and exchange. Okay, this is classic cognitive behavioral therapy. This takes practice. This is hard to do at first, especially because we're trying to really attack those negative, burny outy type emotions. We're going to focus on those first. I want us to do this exercise and focus on some of those things that could be driving the thoughts and emotions behind your feeling of burnout right now. So I want to first identify a negative thought. Okay, let's take 30 seconds right now. I'd like you to write down maybe a sentence or two of one of the more negative thoughts. If you're brave enough, take the most negative thought that you had in the last week. Okay, let's take 30 seconds to do that right now and write it. I'll do this with you, so I'll think of my own example of the most negative thought that I had, as long as you do it with me. So the most negative thought that you had in the last week, and write like a sentence or two around that on the I part of this. Okay, let's do that now. Okay, so I'm ready to go. I'm going to identify, I'm doing this in real time, so I'm trying to be as vulnerable and authentic as possible. I'm going to take actually an example from 2 weeks ago. I was seeing a young man who he recently had, I saw him in Emerge, and he had recently used a pretty hard drug, crystal meth, and he was he had all the symptoms of psychosis. And then I saw him the next morning, and he was livid with me, like, because we kept him in hospital. He was quite unsafe at that time, and he was livid with me and was using all kinds of expletives and curse words, and it was quite vulgar and personal. And my thought was, I'm very ineffective. That was my first thought, and it gave me a really kind of negative, oh, what am I even doing here as a psychiatrist? But that was the thought, I'm very ineffective. Not just a little bit, I thought, I'm very ineffective here. Okay. Here's the second part of that. So this part's easy, identifying negative thoughts. We're super good at that, right? We can identify all kinds of negative thoughts and threats. Our brains, from an evolutionary perspective, are built on that premise, that we can identify negative things in our environment so we can watch out for them. Those threats are ways that we protect ourselves, and thinking about those. And the more we think about something, the more that we think about something. That's how our brain works. So we're super good at this first thing, to think about negative thoughts. So that's the easy part. Here's the hard part, okay? I want to challenge that negative thought. Right? I want to give you a couple minutes to do this with me. What you want to do here is write evidence to the contrary of this negative thought. And I often tell patients, consider yourself in a court of law, and you're telling the lawyer that you only need evidence, and the lawyer's telling you, we're only going to accept evidence in the court of law. I want you to challenge that negative thought with contrarian thinking that goes against that negative thought. Okay, off the top of my head, I will say that there have been many examples where I've been effective clinically in the emergency room in the Psych Emerge, okay? So there have been many examples. That's just one negative thought that I'm challenging, okay? So give yourself a minute and write down maybe 3 pieces of evidence that challenge this negative thought, okay? We want to go against it using only evidence, and numbers are really good too. Like, I had 8 patients who did really well last week. Okay, so we'll give you a minute, because this is the tough part. Challenge that negative thought with evidence to the contrary. Okay, so you gave some evidence to challenge that. The couple things that I could think about for me, so the negative thought was I'm very ineffective here as a working in the psychomerge. And then the second challenge that I had, the challenge to that was I had a similar patient who actually did very well. They got into rehab and they were able to really stay well for a long period of time. So I thought about that patient. The other piece of evidence was later that next day I got some feedback and just, I know it's simple, but this patient said, "You're all right," and gave me some validation that you're doing a good job from their perspective. So I want to use that as a challenge to this negative thought. Okay, here's the third step in this cognitive behavioral therapy exercise. It's to exchange that thought. And I want you to use the word "and" in the middle. That's a really important part of exchanging a negative thought. So what we want to do is we combine these two things, the identifying and the challenging, that's the exchange. We want to create a more balanced thought. We're not creating pure positivity, but we're definitely getting away from that pure negativity. We're trying to create a more balanced thought. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking my balanced thought would be something like, sometimes I'm ineffective in the psychomerge, and there are cases where I'm doing all right. That's a very balanced thought. Okay, so I'll write that down. Sometimes I'm very ineffective, and there are times when I'm doing all right. That's a balanced thought, and that feels different. That sits different than this just percolating in my brain all night, that I'm very ineffective, right? So let's take another minute and do this here. Let's exchange that negative thought with a more balanced thought using the word "and." All right, I'll give you 30 seconds, and then we'll wrap this part of the talk up. Okay, so thanks for doing that with me. We identified a negative thought, we challenged it with contrary evidence, and then we exchanged that negative thought with a more balanced thought. Now, tying this back to burnout, one thing that we know that burns us out is when we let those negative thoughts sit, and those negative thoughts turn into really negative emotions, and those negative emotions turn into chronic negative physiologic experiences. And let's tie that back to my example. If I didn't do this little exercise, what would happen to me that evening when I was doing an emerge shift is I would let that thought fester and sit there, and I wouldn't attack it or approach it with this methodology. And if I would just let it fester and sit there, what it would turn into is a pretty negative emotion. "I'm very effective" would probably turn into a feeling of exhaustion and some despair around that, and it would sit, for me, it sits right here in my gut. And if I let that sit there, that emotional experience for many days or even weeks, that literally has a physiologic impact on how I'm feeling throughout the week, when I'm at home with my 2 young kids, when I'm with my wife, when I see the next patient, that sits with me. That's the root cause that I think of burnout for me as an individual, is those negative thoughts, and they fester and they sit there. So what I have to do is I have to really attack those. And I do that with this cognitive behavioral therapy methodology. If you want to learn more about this, I'd encourage you to shine your phone on this QR code, or you can just download Headversity, the app, on the App Store. SafeCare BC has supplied everyone here with access to Headversity Solo, which is an individual resilience training tool that we've designed for many years. And you'll join over 3 million individuals who utilize Headversity. Download this, shine your light on the QR code, and your code will be SAFEBC, SAFEBC. If you have any questions, we have people in the chat room who can also help you out to get you onto this app. This, once you sign in, should take you right into this cognitive behavioral therapy exercise. So you have an ability to practice it tomorrow or the next day. Okay, let's keep trucking along because I want to cover something else that I think is really important and do a little exercise around something that is another cause of burnout. And this is a cognitive concept called switching states. And I want to first, before I get into this, I want us to do an experiment, okay? And so we have like 200 some odd folks here. And this is going to be a little bit of chaos in the chat room, but I want to do it anyway. I would like us to do 2 rounds of a competition. Now we're all, every person for themselves. I want us to compete. I want us to do, round 1 is going to look like this, okay? I want you to get out a paper and pen. And what you're going to do is hit start on a timer, like that little timer on your phone. Or if you happen to have a stopwatch because you, I don't know, taught gym class in the mid-'80s, maybe you'll have a stopwatch with you. I want you to write out, I am a resilient person, and the numbers 1 through 20. Okay, I just want you to time yourself doing that. And we're going to go ahead as a group and do that. And then after, I'm going to ask to see who had the quickest time. Okay, so on the count of 3, what I'd like us, well, first I'll give us a couple moments to get out a stopwatch. Okay, I can't see anyone, so we might need like a thumbs up in the chat room if we actually have a stopwatch handy and a piece of paper and pen. Okay, I'm going to trust that we have that. Okay, on the count of 3, I am going to ask you to press start, right? I am a resilient person, numbers 1 through 20, and then stop and time yourself doing that, okay? 1, 2, 3, go. All right, I see some times. Other Ryan, Studio Ryan, can you see the times? Who has the fastest time so far?
I'm seeing 19, 18 seconds.
18 seconds?
18 seconds.
Anyone beat 18 seconds?
15 seconds.
15. Do anyone beat 15?
15, 15, 11 seconds.
11. Holy smokes. Anyone beat 11 seconds? 11 seconds. Going once? Going twice? Okay, 11 seconds. Congratulations. That is it. Extremely quick time. Okay, we're going to do round 2. This is the meat of this social experiment here. What we're going to do now is really press that button in our brain that helps us switch sets. And I'm going to make some comments after we do this because this will really elucidate how we are during the workday in a very frenetic workplace like we often see in healthcare, okay? And this is the experiment. We're first going to write a letter, then a number, then a letter, then a number, letter, number, okay? And we're going to eventually write out the whole sequence, but you're going to start with the letter I, then the number 1, the letter A, 2, M, 3, A, 4, R, 5, E, 6, until you're done that whole sequence, okay? All good? All right, so you're going to go letter, number for these 2 things, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Just like you do when you're working a shift, you're like constantly thinking of 10 different things. Then we're going to time that as well to see how we do. All right, so on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, time it, go for it. All right, so we got some numbers coming in hot. We have a couple 40 seconds, a couple 30 seconds. What's the quickest time on their studio, Ryan, so far?
25 seconds.
25 is a very good time to do this exercise.
Yeah.
Does anyone have something that is like more than a minute? That would also be fun too.
We have 54 seconds.
54 seconds is the highest score so far. Excellent. Okay, and we have like a 25 seconder coming in. Anything better than
17.
17? Okay, excellent. All right, so thanks for doing that. Very well done. We have an 11 second on the first round. That's world record pace, and a 17 second, which is, I think, as if not more impressive. What you'll typically find is when you're switching sets or you're quote unquote multitasking, is number one, it's going to take longer to do that task, usually 2 to 3 times longer. In this case, we're multitasking. We're going letter number, letter number, letter number. We don't have practice doing that. Also, our brains literally can only think about one thing at a time, one concept, one focus. So multitasking does not exist. The second thing you might notice is that it's quite messy. Like you cannot write it out as beautifully as possible. And that's simply a practicing effect, but also the way our brains work in processing this. The third thing that I hope you notice is that it's quite taxing. You might find yourself a little more cognitively tired after that exercise than you would after doing the first exercise. And I want us to expand upon this. This is your brain switching sets from one concept to another, going from one part of your brain to another part of your brain. And that's exhausting. We're not meant to do that. That takes a lot of oxygen and glucose in our brain. And I believe that the way our healthcare organizations are set up, I know this is the case for me when I'm doing an emerge shift, for example, is that we're thinking about 10 things at once, and we're constantly doing little mini tasks, writing a note, doing patient care, writing a note, doing patient care, then another type of patient care, then another patient. These are little things that we're switching sets on, and that is exhausting. I have no doubt in my mind that that leads to burnout because we leave that shift having switched sets and not being able to do deep work for 8 hours or 12 hours or 24 hours straight. What do we do here to try and battle this? Mindfulness helps, of course. The thing that helps me is I'll often set a timer. So if I need to do a note, I want to set a 15-minute timer, and I'm not focusing on anything else for 15 minutes but completing that note. I know that is a privilege and a luxury that I have. Often, if you carry a pager or you are doing patient care, you might not have the luxury of 15 minutes to do that. That is what personally works for me. What might work for you is to try and reduce the noise, try and reduce the number of tasks, and try as best you can to finish one task until you get started on another task, even if those tasks are short. That's how our brain should work. That's how our brain does work, and that reduces that feeling of exhaustion. Okay, we have about 5 to 10 minutes left, and I want to end with a couple of really important frameworks that I think can help us with burnout. And this is one that means a lot to me because I notice and I think about this all the time, that our leaders and you in healthcare often are faced with mental health conversations, and we don't necessarily have the training on how to have that conversation. Why do I think about it so much? Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist, but also I got to train for like 10 years on how to have this conversation, and now I have a good framework on how to do it, and I deploy this framework when I have a mental health conversation. How does that help me reduce burnout? Well, I know what I'm getting into when I have that conversation. Is there going to be little mini conflicts and little discomforts in that conversation? Of course there is, but at least I know the roadmap. I know in essence where that conversation is going to start, what's going to be in the middle, and where it's going to end. That also helps the people I'm talking to about mental health when they are having this conversation because they know the roadmap. Here is the roadmap to having a mental health conversation, and I think this is actually more important for a colleague. We can apply this methodology to patient care or whatever type of care, but I would encourage us to have this with a colleague because those are the tough conversations. Having a conversation with a colleague about their mental health, that's when that really feels like, oh man, am I having this right? Am I going to get sued if I do this wrong? Or am I saying something backwards here? This is the framework that we can all follow. The first step is to C, create time and space. Second is to attend. R is to respond and refer. E, earmark time for a follow-up. This is called a care conversation. Right, that first step, C, create time. This is the part that we often forget or miss because we're always used to like a quick phone conversation or texting or on WhatsApp or whatever it is. That doesn't particularly work in a mental health conversation. If somebody's approaching you wanting to talk about their mental health, what we want to do first and foremost is create some time for them. Hey, let's have a 30-minute conversation, 15-minute conversation, 45, whatever it is. Set the frame. Say, we're going into this room. We're going to go on Zoom. We're going to get into an office. We're going to take this seriously. We're going to create that time and space. That's one of the most important communication tools that you have. Okay, second step. A is attend. You want to attend to that person. What I mean by that is ask open-ended questions. What I mean by that is show empathy. Say things that you mean, like, I'm sorry to hear you're going through that, or that sounds very difficult. Those are empathic statements, and we know how important that is therapeutically when you're having a conversation. If you do nothing else, expressing empathy to a peer is going to be the most important thing you do. The thing I want us to caution us on is we often, and especially as leaders, especially in healthcare, people who see a problem, fix a problem, see a problem, fix a problem, I want to caution us against that. Because that is where we get into a little bit of trouble, and that's less therapeutic, is when we rush to a conclusion. It sounds like you have depression, or have you considered seeing a psychologist about this? We're immediately trying to rush to the problem, and that can have the opposite effect. That can be quite invalidating. So that's why I say attend to the person, ask open-ended questions, empathy, don't rush to the conclusion. Step 3 is called respond and refer. We often feel, as peers especially, that if we are having this conversation, maybe all the burden is on me. Maybe I have to fix this person now. Oh, I don't have psychiatry training, or I'm not a psychologist. What do I do here? It's a bilateral responsibility. So I'd say that the best words in this situation, at this point in the conversation, is to say something like, if things get worse, where do we turn to next? All right, if things don't get better, where do we go next? Simple as that, to have a plan that the two of you map out for this conversation. Finally, what you want to do in a care conversation, somebody wants to talk about mental health, earmark time for a follow-up. That is E. That is very important, and we forget it every single time. We don't take the time to say, hey, let's meet again in a week and see how you're doing. How did that follow-up go? Let's close the loop on this. What that does, and this is very powerful, is that in essence, I believe, creates psychological safety. Because you're telling that person, I'm not running away. This wasn't such a scary conversation, and I wasn't so uncomfortable that we're not coming back to it. We're actually going to come back to it. That creates the boundaries for psychological safety in any organization. I think this is so powerful. Create time for the conversation, attend, respond and refer, make that plan together. Fourth step is the E, earmark time for a follow-up. Okay, with a couple minutes remaining, I would just like to advocate that the most important thing I ever learned in mental health training, ever, was this second point. It's don't say the word but, instead say the word and. But is the most invalidating and least therapeutic and worst word that you could use. And let's use an example, okay? Let's say somebody approaches you to have this conversation, asking open-ended questions, you set the frame and the room and the time and everything's going great, and you say, it sounds like you're really suffering. I'm sorry to hear about this. But have you considered seeing a psychologist? That is entirely invalidating. All that good stuff you did is thrown out the window in that person's mind, and rightfully so. If you instead say this, it sounds like you're really suffering. I'm sorry to hear you're going through this, and where do we turn to next? And have you considered seeing a psychologist? And have you sought care for this in the past? The word "and" conjoins those two, what we call diametrically opposed parts of the sentence. This is where DBT comes from, for those of you who are familiar with that practice. Use the word "and," never the word "but." Okay. I want to end with a piece around compassion fatigue, because I've faced a lot of this in my career. And I had a professor in early medical school who taught us about the concept. She was a palliative care physician, and she was the professor for our group at the time, and she taught us a lot about compassion fatigue and what it is to be fatigued and burnt out, and how one can protect themselves against that, which is our obligation to do that. And this concept has stuck with me for years and years now, and it's that of staying on your side of the river. And I believe this picture is actually from the Yukon River. My wife's family's from Whitehorse, so I get up to Whitehorse often. And I know some of you have been up to Whitehorse. And when you fly in next time to Whitehorse, if you get the chance, you'll see this beautiful serpentine Yukon River as you fly into the airport. And what you'll see is that the river peaks and valleys and goes through all these beautiful undulations. And what this professor had told us early in our training as psychiatrists and even medical students was that it's important for us to follow along the journey of a patient, but never cross over onto their side of the river. And what that means is we can align ourselves with the suffering of a patient or a friend or even a family member. We can dip and dive with them. We can move along with them, along being on our side of the river, but it's important for us to never cross over and be with them in that seat. And why do we do that? Because we need to keep some distance. Call that a clinical distance. Call that a little bit of meta distance or some cognitive distance from that person's suffering. We can't suffer entirely as much as them when we're working with someone who is in distress, because we need to save some energy for the next person and the next person and the next person. And of course, we need to save some energy for ourselves. That is how we try and work through this epidemic together, is to try and save some of that energy for ourselves and stay on our side of the river and really personalize some of these tools to our own effect. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today to talk about something that I think is so important that we all need a lot of work on. We all have an obligation to work on this ourselves so that the system can continue to function and we can continue to take care of ourselves and those that we care for in the workplace. If you are interested in this topic writ large, we are going to send you an email about the mental health epidemic and how we think about preventing this from worsening, and we think about a community health model. If you're interested from a workplace perspective, we will send you a copy of that ebook. I'd love to get feedback on it, and of course, feedback from any part of the session. And with that, I'd like to thank you very deeply for joining the webinar today. And we'll send you an email to follow up with resources, ebook, if you want to learn more. And of course, if you just want to connect with me and chat, that's okay too. Ryan, Todd, I'm on LinkedIn. And thank you for joining the session today. I really appreciate your time.